Action. Welcome back to Show and Tell. I'm Billy and I'm your host. You can find me on Ravelry and Instagram at billietoy, and you're going to see that in the top of your screen. You also might have seen my husband walk by briefly. If you haven't subscribed to this channel, I hope you'll consider doing so. And there are several icons to the right of the subscribe button. The top one is a little bell that has little jingly lines. That's the one that you want to select so that you'll be notified when I've put out a new podcast. Back at the beginning of October, Roxanne Richardson and I first met on our podcast to discuss a sweater that we were going to collaborate on, which we nicknamed the Harlequin because we were merging two different patterns, and it just seemed easier to describe something that was going to have triangles going down the front and the sleeves as that. It's a 3-color Intarsia project. And once again, she's been gracious enough to come back on my show as my guest. And in just a moment, I'll bring her on. We're going to discuss our progress so far. So without further ado, let me bring you Roxanne Richardson. Okay, it's been a while. I know we were thinking about picking this project up in early November, and things in life happen, holidays, kids come back home and travel and whatever. So I got off to a rip-roaring start because I didn't have anybody visiting me from overseas that I had to drop everything for. So I went merrily along, and Roxanne, on the other hand, has had a delay, but nevertheless, we have plenty to talk about.
Yeah, I had a 2-month delay. Yeah, it was. Yeah, my kid came from overseas. We had a 10-day road trip. I had to write an article. I had to give it, it's like one thing after the other. And I had a lot of knitting to do that I hadn't expected to do. So that's all done. And so I am lagging behind. I have started the sweater though.
Well, I think our conversation today is going to be very interesting because we really haven't talked at all since our last conversation about where we're at, what we're doing, how we're approaching various aspects of this. And just before we started recording, we compared notes a teensy weensy bit. So there's some eye-opening things for me. But let me ask you, Roxanne, to repeat this bit about what your motivation is for doing this pattern. And it's really multiple patterns, but tell us a little about that.
So I needed to do a 1940s sweater as part of my long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade between the 1890s and the 1990s. So I had done 1890s up to 1960s, except for the 40s. And I was stalled in trying to pick a pattern. And so that's why how we came together was we both, wanted to do a 1940s pattern. So when I select a pattern for this project, the goal of the project is to really look at the evolution of the hand knit sweater from the 1890s to the 1990s. And so this is really the era of written patterns, knitting patterns, prior to having them on the internet. And the sweater patterns didn't really show up in knitting patterns until about the 1890s. So this is 100 years of that. And so I'm looking at how the purpose of sweaters have changed in those 100 years, how the construction has changed, how the techniques used in that construction have changed, and how the patterns are presented in writing to the knitter. So I'm looking at all of those things. That's what I'm really interested in doing in the course of all of these sweaters. And so this one sweater has to be a part of that bigger picture. And so when I'm looking for a pattern for a particular decade, I'm looking at something that's sort of representative of that decade. Like you could look at that and go, oh yeah, that's, that makes sense. That's from that decade. And it has to have something about the construction that I can learn from. So that something that's new to me or that I haven't seen before in sweater construction, and to learn how that works. And because a lot of times there are techniques that are very different from what in construction from what we see today, even though there's a lot of different things available today. So I'm looking to learn something. So I will choose a pattern that teaches me something over a pattern that will produce a sweater that I want to wear. If I have to choose between those two, I will choose the pattern that's going to teach me something. So that's my goal. So my goal was always, well, I hope I want to wear this sweater, but at this point, I expect about half the time it won't really become something that I wear. So I don't worry too much about that in pursuit of the project for that decade.
So for the 40s, what was your dream silhouette? Because, you know, we had discussed one thing about the combo that we were going to do was the broad shoulder look that was indicative of the 40s. I've gone ahead and done that, and I can show my sleeve, but it sounds like you took a detour.
Well, so I really liked, we were looking at those two sweaters, and I really liked, we discussed how much we both liked the 2-tone and 3-tone sweaters. That was something we really wanted to do. So I really liked this Harlequin design, this triangle, excuse me, triangle design. But the rest of the sweater it didn't look like it was going to teach me anything. It looked like a boat neck and regular old set-in sleeves. Like it didn't have, like, this whole time I thought, well, the sweater I'm going to knit is going to have those crazy 1940s shoulders, because those are constructed differently than shoulders are in any other decade that I've seen. And I thought, well, that's going to be what I learned. And that wasn't apparent at all in this Harlequin sweater. But that was just from looking at the pictures and making some assumptions. I thought, well, maybe there's a little waist shaping, but it seemed overall to be a pretty plain sweater. And I didn't.
The construction.
Yeah, the construction, like in terms of it's just, I mean, it had Intarsia, but it was just stockinette and this boat neck and regular sleeves. And I thought, well, that's what am I going to learn from that?
Right.
And so, I mean, I did read through the pattern, and I could see, oh, there is some waist shaping, but you know, I've done waist shaping before, whatever. And I actually sat down and drew the schematic going through the pattern, and I realized there was more to the waist shaping than just bringing the waist in at the sides. There were actually waist darts as well, so that you're doing at the edges, you're doing a decrease, but then you're also doing decreases that are centered, it looks like, at the bust, you know, below the bust points. So there's this sort of double decreasing within that round to bring in quite a small waist, and then it comes back out, and then there's even more shaping just at the sides to bring it up to the full bust size. And I thought, oh, well, that is really interesting. I have never done waist shaping like that. I'd kind of heard of something like that previously, but I'd never tried it myself. So that's really interesting. And then I saw that the boat neck construction was not what I thought it was. I haven't done that many boat necks, but to me, they always seem to be like the way to make a really easy sweater for a beginner. Like that the top is just straight across, and then you just, you know, seam the shoulders and leave an opening, and that you just have this slit, and that's what it was. And I'm like, well, I'm going to want shoulder shaping, and if the front and the back are the same, how's that going to fit with the neck? You know, the neck's going to either be up here or it's going to pull the back up. And so I wanted maybe some kind of a neck, and I just didn't know what to do. So I was surprised that there was shoulder shaping. I'm like, okay, there's that, but you still have this neck. And so I kind of drew out, and there's also in the shoulder, you only seam the left shoulder halfway. And then you do some crochet just the selvages there, and then you put snaps in order to make the opening big enough to put over the head. So I thought, well, that's interesting. I it's sort of like when you knit sweaters for little babies, and you leave the one shoulder open. I thought, well, that's really interesting. I haven't done that before either. And I kept wanting to, change that neck, but then I read the instructions for how the neck is constructed, which is, you come up to that triangle that goes straight across, and you're just knitting a few. And then once you're done with that, you start doing the shoulder shaping, which creates a few rows right here. Once the shoulders are done, all you have left are those neck stitches, and you knit for 1 inch. And then you fold that under. So you create the hem. And so this cleared up for me, okay, this is why the sweater was designed that way. You've got the horizontal triangle, and so you've got the horizontal neck edge that runs in parallel with it. And because you're knitting a facing that gets folded in, you have to have all of the stitches on the needle to knit across that neck opening. And so I kept thinking, well, what if I took that last triangle out and I could put a neck in there? And then I thought, but how am I going to do that
shoulder
facing?
snap?
And how am I going to have live stitches on the edges, the selvages of that neck opening? Because if you picked up, you'd have a ridge on the inside, and that's the fold point. The whole idea is that it's just coming out of the existing stitches and folding over. And so it's smooth like all of the other hems. And so I'm like, how am I going to solve that problem? And then I remembered the reason I wore this sweater. I know I wore it last time. I thought I should wear something different, except this is my 1930s sweater. And the way that this shaping was done right here in order to work the yoke was what I use as my idea for the neck for this 1940s sweater. So the way this was done is when it was time to do the neck shaping, you would knit across to here, and then you would just turn and go back the other way. You'd turn and slip the stitch and go back. So you'd work 1 stitch less every time you got to the neck edge. So by the time you got up to here, you only had like a couple of stitches on the needle in that way, but you had 1 stitch for every 2 rows going down this way, which is not enough to knit across something that length. And so they have you end up doubling the stitches as you go across it's pretty interesting the way that you double the number of stitches. So you have all of these live stitches on the needle along the edge of this yoke. So when it's time to work the yoke, you have live stitches all the way around. And so I thought, well, what if I used, and this was actually pretty common in yoke sweaters from what I'm seeing, at least in the UK in the 1930s. So I thought, well, what if I did that for the neck right here? What if I did the shaping, created this, straight across a little bit, a few inches here, and then did this shaping up here to create this neck opening. And then I could do these increases along the edge there. So I'd have all of the stitches I needed in order to work that 1 inch facing that I could then turn under all the way around the edge and sew down. So then I thought, well, so I did some swatches this past weekend to try to see if the idea would work and what it would look like. And
oh, you haven't started yet?
I haven't started what? The sweater? I've got the sleeve. I've got the sleeve.
Oh, you do
started.
have the sleeve. Okay.
But I want to swatch. I wanted to swatch the neck because I wanted to kind of get an idea. Because I was in there drawing the schematic, whatever. I just like to understand how the sweater works before I even start. So I did start. And I just re-knit the hem for the first sleeve. I'm going to cut the old one out and grab
wait,
it.
excuse me, before you go on, I want to weigh in that you have often said that 2 people may have the same goal, but the way they get there can be completely different, and they may even get the same results. Well, in this case, I thought we had the same goal. I thought we were both doing these big shoulders, but it seems like you veered off in favor of the techniques that you were learning from just the Harlequin pattern, and you stayed with only that. I, on the
Yeah.
other hand, did merge them, but in maybe a different way than you were thinking. So I never saw the actual Harlequin pattern. I only knew that it had those triangles, and it was the triangle motif that I liked. But I did have, and I did use the, what is it, Checkers and Charm, the navy and white block
Right.
sweater with the big shoulders. So I stuck with the big sleeve, the big shoulder. And I want to see your sleeve, but I also wanted to show my sleeve. This was the first thing I knit, the sleeve, because I wanted to get a feel for the Intarsia and how that was going to work. And so here's my sleeve. I have it kind of pinned together. I left my stitches live at the bottom. I haven't bound off because I'm not sure exactly the length. I probably want to put more of the olive green at the bottom, but I think I'm okay with this, the sleeve. So I'd love to see your sleeve.
Yeah, well, I so far I decided to start with the sleeve because I have the most difficulty with fingering weight yarn, like that my gauge can vary over the course of the year because my hands swell in the summer. And so the smaller needles can affect my gauge. And so I just wasn't 100% confident of my gauge. And so I thought I'm going to start with the sleeve because the way that you wouldn't know this because you haven't seen the pattern. The way this sleeve is constructed, it's completely straight up to the armhole. Like it's just straight. It's like 12 3/4 inches around. And it's just that way all the way up until it's time for the cap shaping. And
I think the other sweater, the one that I was working off of, also is straight, but it's not a full-length sleeve. It's a sleeve that starts, I think, at the elbow. And I do believe that that was also straight up.
Yeah,
But
and this one
altered that
like,
to make it a long sleeve.
It has only like a 13-inch seam, so it's not a full length. It's meant to be kind of loose around. So I thought, and so the underarm is after you've done like you're into the 5th set of triangles when you start the underarm. So I thought, well, that's going to give me a good 10 inches or something, basically a giant swatch. So I had created my cast on number based on what I really think my gauge is. But I'm going to wash and block after another triangle and make sure, confirm my stitch and my row gauge, because that row gauge is really important for the sleeve cap, getting it to fit into the body. And so I thought, well, this is perfect to just, if I feel like this is a little too narrow, I could add a few more stitches before I get to the underarm.
So you started at the bottom of the sleeve and worked up.
Yeah, I'm working bottom up. Yeah, and you're working top down.
I did the opposite. Normally with a vintage pattern, I would start at the bottom, but more and more, because my biggest problem area is my hips. I want to have that be the last thing so I can try the whole sweater on, because I've had several sweaters where I got to the end and I tried it on and I really didn't like how it looked across my belly and my hip area. And then it's too late.
Yeah.
If you start at the bottom, you cannot really go back and alter that. So I thought, well, if I start at the top, certainly of the body of the sweater, then I can really tweak the lower part where it's going to be a problem for me in terms of like the overall fit. Of course, I want the top to fit well too, but this one, I started at the top because I really wanted to see how the shape of this sleeve was going to look, so that when I started the top of the body, I could put them together and see, is it fitting well before I go on and knit the whole rest of the sweater. I've been burnt so many times with having things that I had to completely rip out an entire sweater and redo because the fit was just so bad. So
Well, my 1960s sweater, I had to rip out the sleeves. I'm gonna have to reknit them. And yeah, which is, and it's fingering weight as well. And so, yeah, the sleeve caps are very similar to that 1960s one. So I kind of learned from that. And this is why I'm being so careful with
mm,
this one to make sure that I get the exact shape
so
that
you're
I want
saving that
it.
for last to tweak that. I'm saving the hips for last.
Yeah.
Speaking of the waist shaping, I have done another sweater, Charisse. It's a contemporary pattern, but it has a really vintage feel. It's one of my earlier sweaters where the designer did put in bust darts and side shaping. So I was aware of that. It's probably not exactly how yours is. Um,
Well,
I'm
I was
reluctant
aware
to
of them
show you my
for
sweater, but I did actually end up doing that on this because I thought my yarn is a little bit stiffer than I would have liked. And I thought the stiffness around my waist is going to be really unappealing. So I better make it a little more form fitting. So I also added, but I didn't do it in the front. I didn't do bust. And I wasn't taking it in. I was letting it out. I was adding stitches in the back for my bum.
uh-huh.
So, I'm adding stitches for the hip because I'm working top down. And I added a couple extra stitches just in the back to give me a little more ease because I really don't want it tight around that area. And I don't know yet, but this is probably a good moment for me to show. And then we can come back and talk about the next because I'm done with the neck. So here's the big reveal.
Ah, okay. Well, that's nice for me to see how that looks with that straight across thing. Cause that's the thing is like with that design was it was so intentional to have those two parallel horizontal, neck with the triangle. And I was really concerned about ruining that look by changing the
I
neck.
didn't exactly do their neckline, but I kind of rolled my own. And I guess I could talk about what I did. I haven't really had a lot of design experience, but one thing I knew from knitting a baby sweater that had too small an opening for a big baby head was that I really wanted this to be big enough to go over my head without struggle. So starting at the top, I was able to see as I went, is it big enough? And can I get it on? And while I was on the needles, I was trying it on over my head, even though I had very few stitches. So what I actually did was, if I can remember, it's so long ago.
That's a fairly sizable neck opening then.
It is. It's bigger than it
yeah.
needed to be. What I did was I started at the shoulder and I worked down, but I also cast on this shoulder. So I was working both of these sides separately, but at the same time so that I could make sure they were absolutely the same length from left and right. And then I cast on, let me get some of these loose threads out of the way. Then I cast on a number of stitches in between them to connect those two panels. So
yeah.
I was increasing
And
until
did you do shoulder shaping? Did you do shoulder shaping at all?
I do shoulder shaping. Yes, I think I did. I think it's here, here, and here. I think I did it in 3 sections. I think.
Okay.
Then I went back and I picked up the stitches at the shoulder and I knit down the back. And I did the same thing, except I didn't do it to the same depth. I just did a few rows on each side, and then I connected a larger area between them. I had stopped at the front as soon as I got to the bottom of the neck because I wanted to knit this first triangle and see where it came to. And then I went back to the front and I figured out, and I might have tweaked that a little bit. I figured out that this was exactly one triangle lower than my back. So that the front and the back, the triangles would resolve at the bottom being
Right. And
exactly.
that's what I did too. I took out that top triangle and then had the neck come down to just right above where that triangle is going to be.
At that point, once I got the first front triangle and now 2 triangles in the back, then I started working, not exactly in the round, but because of the intarsia, and that's what I wanted to talk about. You haven't, well, you did in your sleeve, you did the intarsia. If people aren't familiar with intarsia, I don't know, Roxanne might be better explaining this than I am, but if this is your yarn and you knit across with it, now your aqua is here. And when you go over this way, your teal is going to be here. And if you get to the end, now your olive is here and you come back, this yarn is ready for you to pick up and work back, as is the aqua. If you knit in the round, you're going to arrive here and your yarn is not going to be here. It's going to be here.
Yeah.
So I couldn't go completely in the round. What I ended up doing, because I did want to keep all those triangles happening at the same time, I thought it'd be too confusing otherwise. So what I did was I started on this edge and, well, sorry, under the arm, let's say, here, and I went all the way around the back and completely around to the front. And then it was as if I was
So you have
doing
one
a
seam. You
gigantic,
have one seam. You
it
gotta have
was like,
one seam.
it's like I was doing a gigantic flat piece
Yeah.
all the way from that edge to that edge. And I would go back and forth over this long flat piece. So yes, I will just have this one seam. But it enabled me to try it on periodically because I could just clip
Yeah.
this and not have to
Yep.
take it off my needles and all of that. So I'm coming down the home stretch.
Yes, I'm just getting started. I'm just out of the gate.
So also about the neckline, I too wanted a firmer kind of, I wanted like a nicer quality. I didn't want it to be so sporty looking, to just have a ribbed neckline.
Right.
So I did my neckline in stockinette, not rib.
Did you pick up stitches? Is that what you did?
What I did at the top was I started ribbing so that I could fold it. I would have a line of demarcation to fold it. And then I did ribbing down to the inside. And then I just hemmed it, you know, sewed it down. So
you worked an inch up on the outside and then folded the ribbing in on the inside. So your neck extends up from the opening?
yes.
Okay.
And I folded it down to the inside,
Right.
and then I just hemmed it. I just stitched it in, which is exactly what I'm going to do at the bottom. I knit all the way down, and then you can see where the stitches, the look of the stitches changes. This is a row of knit one, purl one. I didn't do ribbing down here. I did stockinette again, but I do have one row, if you will, of knit one, purl one.
Yeah,
so
as a
that it'll
turn
make it
row.
easy to fold under. I started doing hems like this on a lot of my sweaters because I feel it gives it a nice edge. If it's not a ribbing that's pulling in, but if it's just something that's going to hang down, I don't want it curling up, you know, especially if it's stockinette. So I have found, and I got this from my Aunt Matilda, who was an unbelievable knitter who passed away in the 60s, but I have some of her garments and they all have that hem and they all just lay beautifully.
Mm.
So I have done that on several different sweaters and I'm really happy with that. Sometimes I've done like a PK edging where there's yarn overs, but anyway, I am binding off the lower edge now. So now you've seen,
So you still have one sleeve to go then?
I have one sleeve to go. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a little concerned about that, how the sleeve is actually going to fit in and how that shoulder is going to look, but we'll see. We'll see.
So I am doing Intarsia. I don't plan on doing the whole body in one piece like you. I like smaller pieces. I would rather seam twice. than have the whole thing on the needles at one time, especially having that many balls of yarn to deal with, the colors. So
Do you use bobbins?
I do not use bobbins. I've been trying a few different things with this particular sweater to see if there's a different way of managing yarn for this sweater, because it's only 4 colors. Like it's two of the gray and then 1 each of the yellow and the
Right.
purple. So usually what I do is calculate how many stitches are going to be in that shape and that color, and divide that by the stitches per, by the stitch gauge. So I know how many linear inches that would be. And then I figure out how much yarn, multiply that by 3 to calculate how much yarn. And then
Okay.
I create a butterfly of that. Like, so if it's like 4 yards, and then I just measure 1 yard out like that, 1, 2, like, I just do an estimate like that. And so it's sort of like a bobbin. It would be hanging down in the sort of a center pole, but they tend to wrap around each other. And when they're just hanging like that, they tend to tangle. And so I was, trying to figure out how I would want to do it differently. And I just saw a tweet this week from the Center for Knitting and Crochet. They're like an online knitting museum archive thing, but they posted a patent that Anne MacDonald had won in 1985. So Anne MacDonald is the woman who wrote No Idle Hands, the social history of knitting in America. So she came up with this thing called what did she call it? Something like the Great Scott Argyler. But basically it was a way of, what is the order of the colors? So I've got gray, yellow, purple, gray on the right side. So she would have a container for each one of those. And this was she created this actual device and had it manufactured. You can do this with Tupperware containers, but and so each ball is contained in its own little container and with a hole in the top, and the yarn comes out and you have it all on a platform sitting on your lap. And so you work across the colors, you change the colors. So you're linking them together. You turn the work. And as you go back in the other direction, linking them, they untwist. So by the time you get to the end of the second row, they're all back. Nothing's twisted. And because it's all sitting and anchored on your lap, nothing is going to dangle and twist around itself. So I
Will
thought
that work with any number of colors? Like, I'm imagining those twists not necessarily untwisting if you have many colors happening.
Yeah, I could never visualize how this would work. Like when I'd heard about this in the past, like people do this, I'm like, how's that going to work? Because you have to link them together. When you see what it like, if you get to the end of the row and you lift your knitting up and you can kind of see how they're linked together, it's not the nightmare you'd think it would be. So it does work, but the trick is, what kind of containers are going to use and where are they going to sit? Like,
you're not riding the New York City subway doing that.
Right. And I'm not buying the Great Scott Argyler by mail order, like, in 1986. So, I was trying different things and it kind of works, but I'm not completely sold on that. Sometimes I just pull off the amount of yards I need and just let all the strings hang and then just pull out the one that I need. So
I love these bobbins. I bought them back in the 1980s when it seems like everybody was using them, because I'm not going to say that I'm perfect about this. They sometimes do tangle and it's not too bad, but it's only because I neglected to tighten this. When you pull it, there's a little opening here. I don't even know if you can see it. There's a little opening there, a little slit that the yarn just pulls right into. So I can get this to be very close to my knitting and there's no length.
And you
of yarn.
don't find that much yarn hanging is like putting too much tension on the, like, that's what I don't like
No,
about having
because
more yarn than need.
I usually have it pretty close. And then when I get to this bobbin and I'm going to use the yarn that's on it, I'll just unpop it from there. Sometimes I don't do it every single time. I might wrap it around a few times and then lock it in. So if I just unlock one, I'll get enough yarn to do what I'm doing with that color. And then theoretically, I should roll it back up before I move on to my next color. If this is short and right up against my knitting, there's no opportunity for it to tangle down anything because it's right there at the needle.
Yeah, I
I'm being honest, I don't do that.
I think for me, in the way I knit, I would like that much yarn hanging. I think I would like, it would feel heavy to me, but that's because of the way I knit when I'm working in Intarsia.
Well,
So,
I have a lot on here. You don't have to put that much on here.
yeah,
It's not really that heavy. You know, a whole ball is an ounce. So what is this?
yeah.
You know, it's
Well, you know, and if it works for you, if you're getting if it works for you and you're not, you know, it's not, you're not getting the tangles or whatever, then
not too
yeah,
bad. I could be better at managing it. That's why I was wondering if you had a particular system to tell people like, this is a way that's really worked well for me. So I'm saying, I'm
yeah. I
kind of married
think
to these. I like them.
For me, it also depends on how many color changes there are. Because I have worked like a sweater back in the late 80s, early 90s that had 30 color changes per row. Because it was just this Welsh poppy thing. There are so many colors. And it's just, you know, and you might have 3 colors that are all like within a couple of stitches of each, you know, it's just so many. And so as opposed to having 4, which is not really a big deal, which is why I'm experimenting with to see, because it's not a big deal if they get tangled or whatever. It's 4 strands, it's
Right.
not so hard. But if
Right.
you have 30, it's like yeah, it's I don't know that they're like, I try different things because some things work better for some projects than others.
I had more than 4 because I was doing the whole thing.
Right.
So I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 instead of 8, because in this area where it's
Right.
part front, part back, I was able to merge that into, you know,
Mhm.
one big thing. So it wasn't so bad. I'm glad that this is winding down. I hope that everything comes together in a fit that I'm happy with. Otherwise, I'm going to have a lot of headaches and a lot of ripping back to do. So I think this was pretty good. I wanted to also mention that down below in the show notes, I will give a link to Roxanne's podcast where she and I discuss some other aspects that haven't been discussed here about sizing and gauge a little bit. So do go over there and check that out as well. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.